Well, I'm glad you're here this morning. We call this Friends Sunday, and if you didn't bring any friends, you're still welcome. We're glad you're here. I don't know if they're taking account on how many people brought guests, like if we're going to give away a turkey or a ham or an automobile or something, if you brought the most. I don't know about that, but for the record, since I don't know, but it might happen, I want you to know that I brought my son and my daughter. That's 2. I brought my sister and I brought her husband, so that's 4. And then our daughter is in her 3rd trimester, so that's a 2/3. And she's pretty far along in that trimester, so if there's a tiebreaker, give her 3/4. We're thrilled to death that you're here, and I'm glad to be here. Let me tell you a little bit about my sister, since she's here, and since I'm up here and she's back there and she can't do much about it. There is an age difference between the 2 of us, and my brother's 2 years older, and I can remember my brother and I being excited about having another kid in the family because we thought that was going to be another playmate for us, but they brought her home and she was a baby. And so what we discovered, while she was cute initially, eventually we found out that she was pretty boring. She slept a lot. I'm not kidding you. And she ate a lot, and she got a lot of attention, and everybody told her she was cute. And Rick and I didn't get much. But she grew up a little bit, and the next thing we discovered about her is that she was as dumb as a rock. Now, I know that sounds harsh, and before you judge me, let me plead my case. So, as she got a little bit older, my brother and I invited her to come and play with us with our little plastic toy soldiers and our little plastic cowboys and Indians. And come to find out, she didn't know anything about war strategy at all. And she didn't know that when the Indians are attacking, you circle the wagons. So we didn't let her play very much with us. She learned a word that I didn't know, even though I was older than her. I'm told that if you're wearing pants that kind of match a jacket, and a jacket that kind of matches a tie, and a tie that kind of matches a shirt, and if shoes and belts go together, you're wearing an ensemble. I always thought that was a brass band or something. But what we found out about my sister is that what she enjoyed was changing out the ensembles on little Ken and little Barbie. And how in the world an individual get pleasure out of that, change them 5 times in an hour, we never did figure that out. But I really want to tell you about my sister is that she grew up to be a really good lady. She's had a really good career at GoDaddy.com when they lived up in Iowa, and then her husband came here for employment. And she now works with an organization that is responsible for drilling water wells in underdeveloped countries. It's a nonprofit organization, and it fits her heart perfectly. And she married a fella named Richard, and if you ever want a good friend, you probably ought to get to be friends with Richard real quick. I've never had a time in all the years that I've known him that I haven't asked for his help. And he didn't just offer his help, he came and helped. And I didn't care what it was, whether it was putting up fencing or building a barn. He's been there. And he's just got a heart of gold. She married a good man. She grew up to be a good lady, and she married a good man. That's about all the friends I got. Well, I got one more friend besides them. Old David Lancaster sitting right back over here, about halfway back. He's my friend. And I like David for a lot of reasons. Him and his good wife, who's gone on to glory, has always been so gracious to Angie and I. And I appreciate David for a whole host of other reasons, but I like him most of all because his name is David, like my name. And we're going to have lunch after we get through preaching here in just a minute. And I'm not going to preach very long, don't worry about it. We're going to have lunch over here, and all the ladies of the church brought dessert. So there's a big whole section of desserts over here. And David and I are going to be going over I want you to go get your protein. So y'all get your meal and your salad and vegetables and stuff, and y'all go eat them. David and I are going to the dessert table, and we're going to find us some oatmeal cookies and some banana pudding, and we're going to use the banana pudding for icing on oatmeal cookies. And so don't come back here to talk to us, because our mouths are going to be full. And you probably shouldn't even come and wave at us, because we're going to have cookies in one hand and banana pudding in the other. And we'll get with you just as soon as we get through doing what we're going to do. And of course, y'all probably be reading about us next week in the bulletin, because we'll probably be in the hospital because of some sugar disorders, but that's okay. I am so glad you're here. I'm glad to be here. You may not know much about this congregation before we get to this lesson, if you're visiting. But this congregation seeks to be, aims to be, and strives to be the church that is found exactly as the church was found in the New Testament in the first century, the church that Jesus built. That's our only goal. We use the Bible as our only authority. We don't have a creed book or anything else, any place else besides the Bible for our authority. We have shepherds or pastors or bishops who oversees our souls here. They followed the good shepherd, the chief shepherd, Jesus. And their role is to keep us safe and secure. They're not the administration of this church as the denominational world defines administration. My Bible says that Jesus was given all authority, and that means that we don't have any authority but that which is derived from Christ Himself. These shepherds have another responsibility besides just watching out for my soul. They have to watch out for their own soul. They have to constantly be vigilant about who they are and what they're about. Paul warned at least 2 different congregations about men who had led that congregation and who had gone astray. And he said, you watch out for them. And so these men are not put in a position to where they're just anybody and everybody and do what they want. They are men of God who have been groomed by the Holy Spirit, who give an account of my soul and their soul. And that's who you're worshiping with this morning. You're worshiping with a Bible-believing, Christ-ordained congregation of redeemed individuals, and we're just glad you're here. I want to focus just very, very briefly on Hebrews chapter 12, and if you look at the screen, you'll notice that this particular passage of Scripture starts with the word therefore, and that kind of seems like a strange place to start if you think about it. So let me just give you a couple of pieces of information as to how the writer of Hebrew got to Hebrews chapter 12 with the word therefore. And you really have to go back all the way to Hebrews chapter 10, where he is talking to a group of believers. As a matter of fact, he identifies them as people who have received the light. They are redeemed. And he recounts all of the conflict and the suffering that they've had to endure, all the insults that they've had to endure, all the injustices they've had to endure, and when they themselves were not experiencing those things, they stood with other brethren who had received the light who was experiencing those things. And then it subsequently tells us that these very brethren, some of them have had their very property confiscated as a result of believing in Jesus. And it says in verse 36 of 10 that they must persevere in order to receive the promise. Then he jettisons over to chapter 11 of Hebrews, and we always talk about that as being the hall of faith because it gives us a list of all these men who were men of faith. And as a result of their faith, it was accounted to them, or God credited them with His righteousness. They were redeemed and righteous individuals before God. But it is interesting in that, men in that list are Abraham, wives like Sarah, Samuel, Gideon, Samson, you name it, and they're in there. But it's interesting, as he gets close to the end of chapter 11, he says, actually in the middle of chapter 11, he says, they saw the promise, but they could only see it out in the distance. They didn't experience it, even though they were men of faith and it had been credited for them for righteousness. And then it says later on in that text that they will eventually receive the promise, and they will receive the promise with us, with the Hebrew brethren and with me and you. And of course that leads you to kind of think about, well, are you telling me that we haven't received any of the promise? Everything's still sitting out there somewhere. And that answer is kind of yes and kind of no, isn't it? I mean, we have received promise. All the work of atonement has taken place at Calvary. Atonement is done. There is a path back to God that didn't exist before Calvary. We have the forgiveness of sin if we choose to have faith in God, the Bible kind of faith. We have the providence of God in our lives today. We have ability of prayer and taking everything before the throne, and God listening to our prayers and deciding what He wants to do about our pleadings. And so we have already received some piece of the promise, but there's another piece of the promise that they had not received, and that these Hebrew brethren had not received, that you and I have not received yet. And that piece of the promise, the glorious piece of that promise, is the day that Jesus will confess me, because I have confessed Him here on this earth, that He will confess me at that point in time to the Father and to the angels. And He will say, Father, this is a good man. He was a faithful servant. He was well-pleasing to me. He's in. And so we're all looking forward to that promise at some point in time. So today, it's only right that we come together to honor each other as believers. It's only right that we come together and remember those who have gone before. And it's only right that we come together this day, this special day called Friends Day, and that we remember the charge that we've been given, the main charge of our life. And that's exactly what this writer addresses in Hebrews chapter 12. That we are to persevere, that we are to hold on, that we're to never to give up, no matter what. Well, Winston Churchill attended. He's one of the greatest orators I think I've ever had the pleasure of listening to. I like his thought processes. But he grew up in a boarding school called Harrow School. And when he became Prime Minister of Britain, the war had just broken out. And he went there and spoke in 1941 back to that school at the request of the chancellor of that school. And in that particular message in 41, his message was bleak, bleak, bleak. Hitler was advancing throughout Europe at an alarming rate. Well, he was invited back to speak to the graduating class in October of 1942. And in 1942, he said, the situation that we face today, while still desperate, is nothing like it was 10 months ago when we were alone, when we were way underarmed, when you yourselves, citizens, were experiencing the bombings of the enemy planes that flew overhead. And he said, you know, it's never the short and the sharp that's important. It's the long and the tough that matters. And he said, I know that you as British citizens realize that no matter how many months or how many years or how long it takes, that we're in for the long haul. And then he finishes that speech by saying, in a very almost inaudible manner, and therefore we shall never. And then a little bit louder, never. And then with a shout, never give in and never give up. Never will we surrender. And so our Hebrew writer has that very message for me and you today. As that we will never, never, never give up. Now I realize that this morning you're probably sick and tired of all the things that I'm sick and tired of. I get that. We live in a wicked world, and Timothy says, Paul says to Timothy, that the wicked are only going to wax worse and worse and worse. And so if the Bible is true, which I believe it is, I think this whole world's just going to get worse and worse and worse. We probably ain't seen nothing yet. So I'm sick of all the politics and all the malice and all the hatred, and I bet you are too. And I'm sick of all the worries about the economy being up and down and sideways and who's going to run the global economy, and you probably are too. And I'm even kind of sick and tired of all of our smartness, where we've created things that have polluted all of our streams so I can't swim in them and can't drink the water. I'm kind of sick and tired of not being able to walk down the street at night in a busy city without fearing for my life. I'm kind of sick and tired of everything that Hollywood's producing that's being aired on TV that's not worth watching. See, we're probably all sick and tired of the same things if we think about it. And that's pretty easy to get discouraged real quick. It's real easy to think about quitting. But the problem with that is when I'm focused on those things, and when I have a steady digest of CNN and Fox News who just about kill anybody, when I have a digest of those things, I'm looking and focusing my things on the wrong things. And that's what the Hebrew writer is going to tell these brethren. You're looking at the wrong things. And so he starts the conversation by saying, therefore. Now the Greek is better translated there to say consequently. Consequently, and really the question is what about ourselves? Consequently, what about us? Because he transitions from chapter 11, all these historical figures, now to talking about his present audience, and he says, so it was with them, but what about us? And in this short 4-verse section, he gives at least 6 reasons as to why you and I will never, ever, ever give up. And it starts with the fact that the Christian, the believer, has a goal. He has something out in front of him, and he's in a race. And in that race, he runs and he runs and he runs until he gets to the tape, until he gets to the goal. He never stops running. Now, it says it's not just any race either. Some of our religious world and some of our non-religious world has decided what that race looks like. They've determined for themselves. They're so smart, they've rationalized for themselves what that race looks like. But that's not what this writer says. He says you run the race that has been marked out for you. You stay in that race. We call that race something like discipleship. And that's the race that we're involved in. You know what? We're going to run until we can't run no more. Until he takes us home. Now, I realize that if you look at some track events and they run those long distance races, there'll be 30 runners on that field, and they're out there almost tripping over each other. And so you might assume that you're in a race that's really, really crowded and there's a room for me on the track. Well, brethren, you have to realize not everybody in this race. As a matter of fact, if we consider the billions and billions and billions and billions of people who are on the earth today and who have been in times past, and if Jesus is right, which once again I believe he is, there's a broad path and a narrow path, and the narrow path is pretty narrow. And so it's not near as crowded as you think it is. There's plenty of room for you on the track. But once you get on the track, you stay on that track and you run and you run and you run. But more than a goal for the believer, there's an inspiration for the believer. Because that believer, you and I, are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. Now I'm sure that when this writer of the Hebrew letter, I'm sure that when he went through and wrote chapter 11 with all of those names of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, all those names, I'm sure that the Hebrew reader, as he read that letter, I'm sure that their soul was stirred by those names. These were their ancestors. They knew the history. They knew the hardship. They knew it all. And I'm sure that their soul was just stirred inside of them. It may not stir me and you like that. I mean, it's good information and it's encouraging information, but it's not the same as it was for them. So I wonder if just perhaps, I'm not suggesting we write anything in the Bible that's not there, but I just wonder if you would ever consider your own hall of faith. Men and women who invested in you to get you to the point of believing that Jesus is and that he could save your soul, and then that they helped you grow spiritually. what would your Hall of Fame look like? What would those witnesses look like? And I don't know how this witness deal works. I'm not going to pretend I do. I don't know if some way or another the angels work that out and these guys right here do something. I don't know about any of that. Maybe it's just the fact that we're able to recall their lives and have witnessed their lives, and that's the witnessing that they do. But I'll tell you one thing. I know about some men who have been very influential, and consequently, it is all about me. And so Claude Guild, who started Fort Worth Christian University, it financially failed. No, Claude just didn't know what else to do besides preach and preach and preach. And one of the best preachers there ever was. I don't know how many men and women he baptized over the course of his career. And that was the mark of his success. Not finance or not how big the church was, but how many people that he was able to teach the gospel to. And he taught me about the importance of teaching the gospel. Clyde Payton, Sunset School of Preaching. I don't know if you know this about old Clyde. And he has a brother named Gerald and another brother. And they were all missionaries in Italy for a good number of years. And man, they were causing havoc in Italy beyond measure. And the Catholic Church didn't care much for it. The Catholic Church, a state church religion, went to the government of Italy and ultimately had the Paytons thrown out of the country, revoked their visas, had them thrown out of the country. Wouldn't even let them preach over there. Never let them come back to the country again. They never went back to Italy in all the years after that. Clyde moves out to Lubbock, starts Sunset School of Preaching. You know, Clyde bought a bunch of houses out there. And he rented them to students who didn't have all their support raised. And he rented them at a lesser rate than what the mortgage payment was, and he paid the difference. And I knew something about carpentry. I wasn't good at it, but I was average at it. And he needed somebody to take care of those 45 houses. And he knew I didn't have all my support. And old Klein said, Dave, if you come and take care of my houses, I'll see that you get through school some way or another. I'll see that every bill gets paid. Don't worry about it. I was over at Klein and Joe's house all the time talking about different projects that we had going on with those houses. And old Klein is one of the witnesses that's spurring me on, a piece of my inspiration. Now, we all know about witnesses, right? Witnesses get up on a witness stand and they attest to a set of facts. Why, we would think somebody that got up on the witness stand and didn't say anything would be about a half-wit, wouldn't we? We wouldn't think much of that witness. But this is not just a mere spectator. This is somebody, because of their life, because of their destiny, because of who they were and what they were, they witnessed to us that the promise and the race is there and worth running. But, of course, with every piece of good news of being in a race that leads to promise and having witnesses that will help us, there's always bad news, isn't there? Because we have the ability to have a hindrance of sins that so easily beset us. Now, it's real interesting because I've done some training. I know that when you look at my physical physique up here today, you're not thinking that, but I've done some training in my life, and one of the things that you do that is you use weights. And so when you're preparing for certain races, weights can be a really good thing. But I tell you what, I never, ever, ever got on the track carrying my weights. Not one time. Not one time. And these weights here, whatever they are, they can easily beset us. They can easily cause us to be distracted and wander off the track and not stay where Jesus would have us stay. And I mean, that's exactly what Satan's all about, isn't it? If you would just consider these Hebrew brethren who received this epistle, they were close to going into apostasy for two different reasons. They were thinking about getting off the track. They were talking about falling back for two reasons. One was external pressures. I mean, they were suffering injustices. Rome was against them. They lost their properties. I mean, everything that could happen to them had happened to them. But not only that pressure, they kept looking over their shoulder at the Levitical system, at the old law, and they say, you know, they just like the children of Israel said, if you just let us go back to Egypt, we'll have food to eat. They kept saying, man, if we could just get back to the law, things would be better. I mean, this Jesus who thought we would follow, we thought we were to follow him, and lo and behold, he got himself crucified, and now we're suffering all these injustices. We may have made a mistake. We may have made a wrong decision here. That's old Satan talking. Satan will use your family. He'll use your friends. He'll use religious people who look religious. He'll use any tool he can use to hinder you in this race. I mean, he doesn't want you to get promise, brethren. He doesn't want you to get promise. That means his defeat and God's victory. But the good news is I don't have to put up with it. I don't have to put up with it. Because of the work of the cross, I'm able to set every hindrance to the side and run my race. But then there's a means to how the believer has to run that race. He has to run it with perseverance and endurance and patience. He has to hang in there. Now, I am a guy who likes to go from 0 to 50 just as fast as I can. If there's a problem, I'd rather solve it and be done than I had talk it to death. And so there's a lot of things in my life that kind of evolve around being a sprint. You know what I mean? But this race ain't a sprint. This is a long, long run. And I've got to have patience. And boy, that sets at odds with everything that this world believes about get what you can get and get it quick. But we run the race with patience. I may not win the race. As a matter of fact, when I was a freshman in high school, I ran track. My main sport was football, and a whole lot better at it. But all my friends went out and ran track, so I thought I should go with my friends. And the coach, it didn't take, our track coach was Jackie Upton. He's a member of the church. You wouldn't know him, but for years and years and years, well, Richard Justice may know him if he knows any of the history of the state of Texas, but he held the state high jump record for high schoolers, I mean, for more than a decade. Old Jackie was tall and lean and lanky. He had a jaw that strutted out, and he had a scowl on his face all the time. He wasn't angry, but he just looked like he was mad all the time. And he was our track coach. And he had me run the 13:20 because he saw my ability at the sprint. And he knew that sprint wasn't for me. And sprinters aren't for Jesus, because they get in the race and they run quick and they're done and they think they're done. That's not the race you and I are involved in. We run a race with patience and endurance. And we never, ever stop until we get to the tape. And then there is an example that we're able to follow. And you remember earlier I said about all the things that we're sick and tired of? And if we're looking at them, we're looking at the wrong things. Well, here the writer tells us who we have to fix our eyes on. And his name is Jesus. And he hasn't just run the race. We know that's true. But he authored how that race ought to be won. He actually wrote down, he gave us the prescription through his word exactly how we are to perform in that race as we run. He knew exactly how to prepare for it. He knows how to prepare us for it. Now, I don't run anymore. After that freshman year, I was so bad. Coach Upton knew I was going to finish about the middle of the pack, and if there's 16 runners on the track, I'm either 7, 8, 9, or 10 on any day of the week. And so I was never going to win that race the way society the way they define winners. But Coach Upton knew that I was going to get to the finish line. And you know, when he saw me in trouble, he would be on the infield of the track, and in that last straightaway when my legs are killing me and my lungs are bursting, and we were headed to that last turn, I'd hear his voice. Out of all the voices of everybody who was in the stands and all the other coaches that were screaming, I hear Coach Upton's voice. I didn't want to disappoint him. And somewhere or another, I reached down and I find just enough to get to the tape. I didn't get in there first, but I got to the tape. Jesus got to the tape. He's our example of how to get to the tape. And we never, ever, ever take our eyes off of him. You know, if I wanted to be really good at something, I'd go find somebody who was really good at it, and I'd learn from them. And that's exactly the message here. When I was in the school of preaching, there's a little town out there called Muleshoe, Texas. I preached out there one Sunday a month for $50. There was an old gentleman out there named Elmer Evans. Elmer went on to glory years ago. He was about 55 years old when I was in school. Elmer was Elmer, hands down, was the best carpenter I have ever met in my life. He lived in Muleshoe. He was a home builder out there. But he was just a good general carpenter in every way. And when I wasn't busy working on clients' houses, old Elmer would hire me to work with him out there so I could make a little bit extra money. And Elmer had 5 or 6 guys who worked for him. And it was okay to work with those other guys. But I tell you who I wanted to be up against working with. I wanted to be up against old Elmer. I mean, he knew everything there was to do. I have to go in and watch YouTube on how to run a combination square sometimes because of some sophistication to it. Elmer knew everything there was to know that he had learned from his youth about how to run a combination square. There wasn't a board that was twisted that he couldn't straighten out. I mean, this guy was good, and he was the guy I wanted to work with. He was my example. And so if I'm going to know anything about running this race and the success of this race, it's because my eyes are fixed on Jesus. And then finally, there is a standard by which we're going to run this race. There's a standard by which we're going to run this race. It says that he endured the scorn and the shame of the cross while he ran. While he ran, he took it all. And so, Jesus being my standard. I mean, which one of us has had one of our good friends betray us for 30 pieces of silver? And if you want to understand that, go back to Zechariah and check in Zechariah. And Zechariah, the prophet who's prophesying of the Messiah to come, says that was the value they placed on his life. 30 pieces of silver. And do you know what? I tell you what silver was worth during that day. You say, well, you know, today we think about, boy, if I had a pile of silver, I'd quit my job and retire. But you know, it says in the Old Testament in 2 Kings that silver was so plentiful in Israel that they didn't even count it. Remember that? Solomon made silver plentiful to everybody. They didn't even count it. It didn't have any value. Which one of us had a friend betray us for 30 pieces of silver? Which one of us has been falsely accused by the world and so hated? Which one of us has been handed over to death? And death unjustly. None of us have been beaten and had thorns placed on our head till blood trickled down. None of us have been laid out on the cross. Had nails driven through our hands and through our feet like a carpenter drives a nail through plywood. Not one of us. None of us have hung for hours while the world mocked us and spit on us. None of us have had a spear thrust in our side, being suspended between heaven and earth. Not one of us. And so until that happens to you, until that happens to me, I run. I run. I run for the tape, and I never, never, never give up. Because I want to get to the tape. And if all those things were to happen to you, that then and only perhaps then, would you have a reason for walking off the track? Only perhaps. And so we run. And we run. This morning, I think that this is accurate. Everybody in this audience is in one of three places. You're on the track running. You're all about discipleship. Or you never came into covenant relationship with Jesus to get on the track. You might be running some race, but you're not running the race that's been marked out for us. And then I know in my life I've been tempted to quit more than once. Maybe you have quit. Maybe old Satan has drug you down and you got slower and slower and slower and got down to a walk, and finally your arms are just hanging limp and you said, what's the use? And you walked off the track. You won at 3 places this morning. Hope to God that you're in the race. But if you're not, we have an old tradition in the church here, and it's just a tradition. I mean, we'll talk to you anytime you want to talk about your soul, day or night. But we always have an invitation song, and it's just exactly what it means. It invites you that if you have a need, and if you think we can help, not us, if you think God can help you with that need, we will support you in prayer or whatever we need to do to be sure that God hears your need. And so we stand and sing, and we ask you to come down the front. But if you just step out in that aisle, you don't want to walk down that aisle, I'll meet you halfway. I'll meet you more than halfway. If you don't want to do that, we have elders in the back here, and any of these shepherds would be more than happy to talk to you about your soul. We don't want a single individual here today to not, number one, be committed to that race. And if you've quit that race, to get back in the race. And if you've never found that race, we're here to help. And we'll do anything in the world for you as together we stand and sing.